Hey guys, welcome back to my channel. Today I'm going to do basic watercolor techniques. Those techniques to make a coffee painting and then turn it into an illustration. Starting with the techniques, there are two main techniques that you use in watercolors: wet on wet and wet on dry. I'm going to explain both of them to you and then show you how to use wet on dry in a painting and then turn that painting into an illustration. So let's go. So here I want to show you guys how the amount of paint on your brush really matters, and the amount of water you use as well. So as the amount of paint on your brush keeps decreasing, you'll see the color getting lighter too. It depends on the color that you want, and then that will determine how much paint you take, and also the amount of water you add, which is a very important thing with watercolors. The more water you add, the lighter your painting is, the paint you use is. And also watercolors, the good thing about them is if you use a lot of water and you pick them off really easily, they leave a very light color. So here you'll see where places where I use more water, it's far lighter, and you can see the stark difference between using more water, using less water. More water will also make it flowier. You won't need to take paint as often, and it'll still lift off the paper really easily. Then there's a special technique called wet on wet, where the paint does most of the work for you. Like, you'd make your paper wet, like a light wash of water, and then you put the paint on it, and you see how wonderfully, amazingly soft it looks and spreads. Unfortunately, I'm not going to show this technique in play to you guys today. I'll do that in a later video. But this technique is really nice for backgrounds and generally larger surfaces. Now I want to show you guys just a small demo of both of these techniques, wet on wet and wet on dry, in the form of a coffee cup, because I like coffee. And there's the sketching. I'm bad at sketching. I should probably do sketches off camera. This takes time. Now we wait for me to finish sketching. Waiting. Just waiting. And then the thing is with watercolors, they're very translucent, so you need to have your sketch be very light. You don't want the pencil lead showing through your painting. Now, for wet on wet, you just spread a thin layer of water, like just simple water over your picture. I accidentally edited it out, but there's a layer of water. And that'll help spread your paint and make it look soft. And since I'm making coffee, I wanted to make the white milky design on top. I'm sorry, I don't know what it actually is called, because I just don't. But the watery wet on wet helps it spread and helps it look softer. You'll see in the wet on dry how different the technique makes it look. And you build up the layers, because in watercolors you need to build up layers to be able to get that intense color, because watercolors are very light, and they get lighter as they dry. A lot of people say that watercolor is the most difficult medium to work with. I was even told that at one point, but then I realized that it really depends on how much you practice, what you practice, and what you're trying to attempt. If you're trying to attempt like something very difficult that is beyond your skill level, or you haven't practiced or something, watercolors are going to be very tricky. But if it's something simple and you're just starting off, with practice, watercolors are quite easy to use. They're not as difficult as people make them seem, and it just takes some steps and some patience. I don't have that much patience, so I don't use watercolors as often as I would like to, but when I do, they're so much fun to use. And you can see the effect that the wet on wet had. You can see it, like, it's slightly blended into the white, not too much to make it look like the white part is brown, but enough to make it look like it's natural. See, when I'm not patient, I kind of make a mess, as I did. can keep building on layers until you're happy with the color you have. Just make sure to dilute it with water and blend it fast, because once watercolor is dry, it's not super easy to mix. You can generally mix them very well because they get reactivated very quickly, but if you use thick, heavy paint, heavy as in a very dark color, it might be a bit more difficult to mix. And you should also use a brush that holds water. Supplies are very important when it comes to watercolors. You can't use an acrylic brush for watercolor pictures because acrylic brushes don't hold as much water. You just need a thicker brush that'll hold water, but it comes to a thin point so that you're able to make details, but you're able to also hold a lot of water. I'm not paying too much attention to the cup right now, which is why it's kind of messy. My focus was mostly on the coffee and the wet on wet technique. Using wet on wet also helps you blend a lot easily because the paper is already wet, so the paint doesn't dry that quickly and you're able to blend it faster. I'm used to blending really fast because I work with acrylics mostly, and acrylics dry so fast. Like 1 minute it's there and it's usable and it's wet, and the second minute it's dry. If you want, I'm linking some of my acrylic paintings up here. You can check out the playlist. It has all my acrylic tutorials so far. Now this is what it looks like wet on wet, and now for wet on dry, which is basically you won't get the clear, you won't get that soft effect that you would get in the wet on wet. It kind of depends on your taste. If you want this kind of harshness, you could say, then you can go for wet on dry. But if you want a softer, smoother feel, you can go for wet on wet. Later in this video, I'm going to demonstrate wet on dry because it's an easier technique that most beginners would find useful to make simple objects or simple things like mugs or cups or stuff. But there's things that you just can't use the wet on dry technique for, and there's things you just can't use wet on wet for. I'll explain that in a bit. Here, see, you can see that while I'm trying to outline things, the paint isn't spreading, it's just staying still, and it's giving it a bit of an uneven shading. I have to move my brush everywhere to have to spread the paint. The paint is doing none of it itself. That's the beauty of watercolors. If you use certain techniques, the paint will do half the job for you. It's not as stressful maybe as acrylics or oils where you need to do everything and it's all in your control. If you like having less control and not doing as much, then you can use watercolors and it'll generally do a lot of the work for you. But here as well, you need to build up the layers because watercolor aren't very intense paints. They're more like not opaque, translucent, and you need to build them up. The good part about watercolors is you can lift it off the paper very easily if it's still wet. Like I'm doing here, it's just a dry brush, there's nothing on it. It's still wet, so I'm lifting it off easily. It helps to make your pictures lighter or take away excess paint if you don't want it there. You can already see the difference. I did as much work on the wet on dry as I did on the wet on wet, and you can really see that the wet on wet looks more realistic, more soft than the wet on dry. See, there you have it, wet on wet and wet on dry. But then there's also some things, like I mentioned before, that you cannot do with wet on wet and you cannot do with wet on dry. Like with wet on wet, you cannot do shading of specific objects. Like here, I've drawn a monk and I've covered the entire thing with water. Even if I want to blend it, the paint will just spread because the water is right there. You can't blend it properly. The watercolor will keep spreading and you won't get your fine edge no matter what you do because the water and the paint will keep spreading. So wet on wet is not the ideal thing for still life or objects that would need precise coloring. Wet on dry, on the other hand, gives you full control of where your paint goes. So you're able to control where the lights are, where the dark is, and how far it spreads, giving you the cylindrical feel or the cuboidal? Is that a word? Cuboidal? That's probably not a word. Give whatever 3D effect you want to your picture. I thought this week's video would be shorter, honestly, but I guess it is kind of short, but the explanation took some time. And yes, I am still going to make a picture, don't worry. It's just I've really time-lapsed it so that it goes way faster than it was in reality. Now for the picture. I'm using wet on dry. There's no wet on wet technique involved here. And it's basically a coffee cup with a coffee cup. They're both cups in a sort. And I'd like it, if you want to do this, please slow the video down. I have really sped it up, so because I didn't want this video to be super long, and I'm sorry if it is really long. It's longer than I usually do, probably twice as long, if not thrice. And I really wanted to show this to you guys because a lot of people don't know the true beauty of watercolors. And they don't realize how simple they can be and how you can just use, even like this, I'm going to turn into an illustration in literally a minute. It takes less than a minute to make it look like it's an illustration from a book. And the only thing you'll need is a pen because it's really, see, you just outline it and it'll look like it's an illustration from a book. And I am going to write coffee to make it look fancier and it'll look like a postcard. That's the thing with watercolors, you can use it for so many different things without even realizing how amazing it is. And I just want people to know how much fun watercolors really are. I hope you liked it.
Like, share, and subscribe. Subscribe. Bye.